All right, let's settle in for a story that comes to us from across the pond, from a quiet little village in England. It's a tale that began not so long ago, back in 1993, and it touches on questions many of us ponder, especially as the years go by. Questions about what happens after our time here is done, about whether there's something more beyond the veil of our everyday lives. We've all heard stories, perhaps whispered tales from childhood, or maybe things we've read about, contacting those who have passed on. Well, this story is about a group of people who didn't just whisper about it. They dedicated years of their lives trying to build a bridge to whatever lies beyond, and they claim they found something extraordinary. Our story centers around two couples, Robin and Sandra Foy, and Alan and Diana Bennett. Now, these weren't folks who just woke up one day and decided to hold a séance for a bit of spooky fun. They had already spent years exploring the world of the paranormal, specifically looking into spirit communication. They were seasoned investigators in their own right, driven by a deep curiosity and perhaps a desire for proof. So, when they came together to form what they called the Scole Experimental Group, named after the small English village where their work would take place, they brought a serious dedication to the table. Their laboratory wasn't some high-tech facility. It was the complete opposite, really. It was a simple dark cellar tucked beneath a quaint 17th century farmhouse known as Street Farmhouse. Imagine it: old stone walls that had stood for centuries, a low ceiling pressing down, and absolutely no windows. No natural light could filter in, no street lights, no car headlights, nothing. This total darkness wasn't for dramatic effect, they insisted. They believed it was crucial for their work, creating what they hoped would be a perfect isolation chamber. Their thinking was that any genuine phenomena, any contact from another realm, would need an environment completely free from the interference and light pollution of the outside world. It was their attempt at creating scientifically sterile conditions for something profoundly unscientific to occur. What's fascinating is what they didn't use. When you think of contacting spirits, you might picture Ouija boards, maybe tarot cards, crystal balls, or other props often associated with mediums. The Scole Group used none of that. No gimmicks, they said. Their setup was starkly simple, just a plain wooden table placed in the center of this empty, pitch-black room. The four of them would sit around this table, hands linked, waiting in the silence and the dark, to keep track of each other, and perhaps to offer a measure of accountability. They wore simple, glowing wristbands. This way, anyone present could always see the location of everyone's hands, making it harder, theoretically, for any sleight-of-hand tricks to go unnoticed. It seemed a practical consideration in an otherwise otherworldly endeavor. Now imagine the patience this required. In those early sessions, they would sit there for hours upon hours, just sitting, waiting in the absolute darkness. Sometimes they talked amongst themselves. Sometimes they even sang hymns or other songs, trying, as they put it, to raise the vibrations of the room, hoping to make it more conducive to contact. Weeks crawled by, session after session yielded nothing but the dark and the silence. You have to admire the perseverance, the sheer commitment to sit in a cold, dark cellar week after week with no results. Many would have given up, dismissed it as a fruitless exercise, but they persisted. Then finally, something changed. It wasn't sudden, more like a subtle shift in the atmosphere. They reported feeling the air become charged, almost electric. A tingling sensation of static electricity would prickle their skin, And then came the cold. Not just a draft, but a sudden, inexplicable plunge in temperature. On one occasion, they documented the temperature dropping nearly 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Think about that, going from comfortable room temperature to needing a heavy sweater in the span of just 5 seconds. Something was definitely happening. It was after these physical signs began that the first voice spoke. It wasn't a whisper from a corner, they claimed, but a voice speaking directly to them, seemingly out of thin air. The voice identified itself as Manu, but Manu stated he wasn't the spirit of a deceased human in the way we usually think of ghosts. He described himself as an entity from somewhere else entirely. He claimed to be the leader of a collective, a team of what he called communicators. This team, he explained, was composed of beings who had once lived on Earth. Scientists, philosophers, technicians, all having passed away decades, even centuries ago. They called themselves the Team of Many Minds. And this Team of Many Minds, according to Manu, had a mission. It was a bold one, to provide definitive scientific proof that life continues after physical death. They promised to deliver this proof in 3 distinct forms: physical evidence, things you could touch and hold; photographic evidence, images that could be seen and analyzed; and audio evidence, sounds and voices that could be recorded. They aimed for evidence that scientists could check, that experts could study something tangible, beyond mere anecdotal accounts. But Manu explained this couldn't happen overnight. They needed to build energy first. It was like constructing something delicate, requiring layer upon layer of effort, seance after seance. So the process continued, but now with a sense of anticipation, and soon the lights began. In the early sessions following Manu's introduction, tiny specks of light started appearing in the darkness. They were small at first, described as being like fireflies flitting about the cellar, but over subsequent sessions, these lights grew brighter, more substantial. Crucially, they didn't just flicker randomly, they seemed to move with intelligence, with purpose. They would respond to questions flashing in reply. They would form patterns, seemingly spelling out words or conveying messages. The group felt they were witnessing phenomena that mediums had described for centuries. But here, they believed it was happening in a controlled, documented environment. The Team of Many Minds gave specific instructions to maintain the integrity of this energy field they were apparently building. The rules were strict. The sessions had to happen at the same time, in the same basement, with only the original 4 members present. No changes, no substitutions, and absolutely no visitors. Not yet. Anyway, they were warned that any disruption, any change in the delicate balance could potentially ruin months of painstaking work. Everyone had to follow the rules exactly. Throughout all of this, Robin Four acted as the group's meticulous chronicler. He kept detailed notes of everything: the time of each session, the temperature readings, the barometric pressure, every light seen, every sound heard, every message received. It all went into his logbook. The Scole Four weren't just passively experiencing strange events. They were actively trying to map them, to document them, with a discipline they hoped would lend credibility to their extraordinary claims. They believed science needed proof, and the spirits this Team of Many Minds had promised proof. The initial lights, the voice of Manu, the strict protocols. This was just the beginning of a journey that would become far, far stranger. In that dark English cellar, the foundation was being laid, energy was apparently building, and the team was preparing to deliver on its promise of tangible evidence from beyond. Okay, so we left our Scole group in that pitch-black cellar, having moved past weeks of silent waiting, into a phase where mysterious lights danced with intelligence and a voice calling itself Manu, representing a team of many minds, promised tangible proof of life beyond death. As incredible as those dancing lights were responding to thoughts and questions, they turned out to be just the opening act for phenomena that became even more physical, even more baffling. The team had promised physical evidence, things you could hold in your hand, and they began to deliver in a way that challenged every notion of how the world is supposed to work. Imagine sitting there in the darkness, hands linked with the others around the table, when suddenly small objects would just appear. One moment, nothing but the bare wood of the table beneath your fingertips. The next, a distinct little thud or clink as something solid materialized right there in the center, seemingly out of thin air. These weren't just random pebbles. The objects that arrived, what are sometimes called Apports in paranormal circles, were varied and often intriguing. There were stones, sometimes small crystals with strange markings unlike anything the group recognized, even ancient-looking coins and curious metal artifacts. The group never knew what might appear next or when. It added another layer of unpredictability to the already strange proceeding. But they felt these objects weren't just curiosities. They seemed intentional, each carrying a purpose or a message. Sometimes the message was incredibly direct. During one session, a small brass locket materialized on the table. It looked quite old, perhaps Victorian. When they examined it later in the light, it appeared empty inside, just a simple empty locket. But someone had the idea to put it under a microscope, and that's when they found it. Etched onto the inner surface with a precision that seemed utterly impossible for human hands, especially on such a small scale, were three simple words: bridging two worlds. Think about the symbolism there appearing in a group dedicated to doing exactly that, bridging the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. It felt like a direct commentary on their mission, delivered via an object that seemingly shouldn't exist. As if objects appearing from nowhere wasn't enough, the team of many minds moved on to the next form of promised evidence: photographic proof. They instructed the Scole group to bring sealed packs of Polaroid film to the sessions, and they stressed the word sealed. Brand new packs, unopened, straight from the store. This was crucial, an attempt to preclude any accusations that the group was somehow pre-treating the film. The idea was to use film that no one could have tampered with beforehand. The process they described for capturing these images was frankly bizarre. Picture this. The four investigators are sitting in total darkness. An empty Polaroid camera. One of those instant cameras popular back then is placed on the table. After a few moments, according to the group's detailed notes, the camera would simply lift off the table and levitate several feet into the air. It didn't just shoot upwards. It floated, suspended in the darkness. Then, flashes of unexplained light would flicker around the hovering camera before it slowly, gently floated back down to rest on the table. Only after this strange aerial display would someone still in complete darkness carefully load the camera with a sheet of fresh film from one of those sealed packs. They'd then take a picture, presumably just pointing it into the dark room or perhaps towards the sitters. The group would then remove the developing picture and watch right there in the dim glow of their wristbands, perhaps as an image slowly emerged from the gray chemicals. What appeared on these photos was astonishing. One of the most compelling examples involved a photograph that developed showing the portrait of a man none of the 4 group members recognized. The photo came, they said, with a clear mental message or understanding. Jeppe Rolls sends his regards, Jeppe Rolls. The name meant nothing to them at the time. It took weeks of subsequent research, digging into obscure historical records, for one investigator to discover who Jeppe Rolls was. He was a real person, a Danish film pioneer who had actually worked for the Polaroid Corporation decades earlier. And here's the kicker: Jeppe Rolls had died way back in 1926. Furthermore, the portrait that appeared on the Scole Polaroid film, supposedly taken in that dark cellar in the 1990s, was a perfect match for the only known portrait of Jeppe Rolls in existence. A portrait that had never been publicly published and was held deep within Polaroid's private company archives. How could an image unknown to the public and locked away manifest on a sealed piece of film in a dark room decades after the subject's death? It was a question that seemed to defy any conventional explanation. And the Jeppe Rolls photo wasn't an isolated incident. Other images appeared on the sealed film over the course of the experiments. Some showed people who had been dead for many years, appearing solid and real, as if they were somehow momentarily captured by the camera. Other photos depicted intricate scenes from the Victorian era, rendered in perfect detail. Still others showed mysterious ancient writing or symbols, and even glimpses of what looked like lost civilizations. The sheer variety was bewildering. Perhaps the strangest claim of all concerned how these images were forming. The group and later investigators came to believe the images weren't the result of light entering the camera lens and striking the film surface the way normal photography works. Instead, they proposed the images were somehow manifesting from within the film itself. They suggested the chemicals inside the film's emulsion layers were being directly altered by some unknown energy or intelligence to create the picture internally. It sounds like science fiction, but the group pointed to examinations by photographic experts who allegedly confirmed the images weren't double exposures or other known camera tricks. These experts supposedly agreed that the evidence suggested the images had indeed formed inside the emulsion, a process for which standard photography had no explanation. The phenomena weren't limited to the visual either. The team had also promised audio evidence, and that too began to manifest. The group started bringing a simple portable tape recorder into the silent cellar during their sessions. They'd set it to record and then proceed with their sitting in darkness. When they played the tapes back later, they were stunned to hear voices captured on the tape, voices that hadn't been audible in the room at the time. And these weren't just faint whispers. Right. So where we left off, the Scole group was experiencing phenomena that defied easy explanation. Objects appearing from nowhere, impossible, images forming on sealed film, and disembodied voices speaking in multiple languages on tape recordings. The sheer strangeness of it all was escalating, moving beyond just receiving messages or curious artifacts into displays of raw physical power that seemed to mock the known laws of physics. The team of many minds, it appeared, was determined to provide evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed, even if it meant turning that quiet cellar into a stage for the truly bizarre. Imagine the scene, sitting in that absolute darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of wristbands, when suddenly perhaps a musical instrument that had been placed in the room beforehand would begin to float in the air. Not just float, but play music, seemingly on its own accord. Notes drifting through the darkness from an unseen source produced by an instrument untouched by human hands. The transcript doesn't specify exactly what kind of instruments, but the effect must have been eerie and captivating. Even more dramatically heavy objects started moving. The very table around which the four members sat, likely a solid, sturdy piece of farmhouse furniture, would begin to lift off the ground, not just tilting or rocking, but levitating inches, perhaps even feet, into the air, held aloft by some invisible force. While the sitters remained linked, their hands accounted for, the group tried to better track these movements, placing glowing panels around the room, perhaps hoping to silhouette the moving objects or see if anything unseen was interacting with them. It was another attempt to observe and document these incredible events, all meticulously logged by Robin Foy. One session stood out as particularly mind-bending, pushing the boundaries beyond space and into the realm of time itself. For this experiment, a piece of unexposed film wasn't just sealed in its original packaging. It was placed inside a locked box. The box was secured, presumably ensuring no one could physically access the film during the session. Yet, when the box was opened afterward, an image had somehow imprinted itself onto the film inside. And it wasn't a portrait or a landscape this time, it was an image of a page from a newspaper. But here's the truly astonishing part. It was a page from a newspaper that hadn't been printed yet. The group had no way of knowing its contents. 3 days later, the actual newspaper hit the stands, and when they compared it, the printed page matched the image that had appeared on the film in the locked box. Exactly. Think about the implications. If true, it suggested the source of these phenomena wasn't just communicating from beyond the grave, but potentially from beyond time, able to access information about future events. It was a claim so extraordinary, it bordered on the unbelievable. Now, Robin Foy and his team weren't naive. They knew full well how all of this sounded. They were students of paranormal history and keenly aware of the long, unfortunate legacy of fraudulent mediums and faked seances that had occurred over the centuries. They understood the skepticism they would inevitably face. That's precisely why they maintained they operated under such strict self-imposed rules from the very beginning. Their insistence on total darkness, the glowing wristbands, the initial exclusion of visitors, the meticulous note-keeping, these were all part of their effort. They claimed to eliminate any possibility of conscious or unconscious cheating among themselves. They even instituted searches of the room and of the individuals before every single session, trying to ensure no hidden devices or props were being brought into the controlled environment. Despite these rigorous precautions, the strange events didn't diminish. According to their records, the phenomena not only continued, but actually seemed to intensify, becoming bolder and more complex as time went on. After 2 solid years of these private sessions, accumulating hundreds of pages of notes and a collection of baffling artifacts and images, the Scole group reached a decision. They felt they had gathered sufficient evidence, and perhaps that the energy field they believed was necessary had reached a stable point. They were ready to take the monumental step of inviting outside witnesses, objective observers who could scrutinize their work and potentially validate their findings. They didn't just invite casual friends or easily impressed believers. They aimed high, extending an invitation to members of the prestigious Society for Psychical Research, commonly known as the SPR. For those unfamiliar, the SPR, founded way back in 1882, is Britain's oldest and arguably most respected organization dedicated to the scientific investigation of paranormal claims. This wasn't and isn't a group of ghost hunters chasing shadows. Its membership over the years has included distinguished academics, respected scientists. Even Nobel Prize winners have been associated with it, university professors, and crucially, professional skeptics. These are sharp minds trained in critical thinking and often specializing in detecting fraud and self-delusion in claims of the paranormal. They were the ideal candidates to put the Scole phenomena to the ultimate test. Inviting the SPR wasn't just opening the door to observation. It was inviting intense scrutiny, rigorous methodology, and a healthy dose of hard-nosed skepticism. You can imagine the weight of that decision. The Scole Four were essentially putting everything on the line. For 2 years, they had worked in isolation, documenting experiences that defied conventional reality. Now they were inviting experts, people whose reputations were built on careful analysis and uncovering hoaxes, into their inner sanctum. Would the lights still dance? Would objects still appear? Would the voices still speak when trained critical observers were present, bringing their own equipment and their own stringent protocols? Or would the magic, if it was magic, suddenly evaporate under the harsh light of scientific inquiry? The stage was set for a fascinating confrontation between the inexplicable events reported in the Scole cellar and the exacting standards of established scientific investigation. The results of this encounter would be pivotal in shaping the legacy of the Scole Experiment. Okay, so the moment of truth had arrived for the Scole Group. After 2 years of private sessions documenting increasingly bizarre phenomena, they had invited the Society for Psychical Research, the SPR, a team of seasoned investigators, scientists, and hardened skeptics into their dark cellar laboratory. You can imagine the tension in the air. The Scole Four believed they were communicating with a team of many minds from beyond. The SPR investigators frankly arrived expecting to uncover a cleverly staged hoax. They weren't there to be convinced. They were there to dissect, analyze, and expose any trickery. Leading the SPR investigation were 3 highly qualified individuals. Professor Arthur Ellison, an accomplished electrical engineer bringing a practical scientific mind. Montague Keene, described as a career skeptic, someone who had spent years investigating and often debunking paranormal claims, also a media expert familiar with methods of deception. And Professor David Fontana, a psychologist with extensive experience in detecting fraud and understanding the nuances of human perception and belief. These were serious people, not easily swayed by flickering lights or strange noises. The SPR didn't simply trust the Scole Group's existing protocols. They implemented their own far more stringent layers of control. Before the sessions they attended began, they sealed the cellar doors with special tamper-proof tape, the kind designed to show immediately if anyone tried to open them secretly. They didn't rely on film provided by the group. They brought their own factory-sealed packs of Polaroid film, unopened and sourced independently. Furthermore, they marked these packs with invisible UV ink, a secret signature only they could verify, later ensuring that the film used was indeed theirs and hadn't been switched. Their precautions didn't stop there. the SPR team conducted thorough searches of everything. The cellar room itself, examining walls, floor, and ceiling for any hidden compartments or devices. The simple furniture within, and even the members of the Scole group themselves were searched before entering the sealed room. The investigators meticulously checked for any hidden wires, projector speakers, or any place where a Confederate or equipment could possibly be concealed. Only after they were fully satisfied that the environment was secure, that there were no hidden helpers or secret contraptions, that this was truly a controlled space by their exacting standards, would the session begin. The first session under SPR observation started predictably enough, with absolutely nothing happening. The 4 Scole members and the 3 SPR investigators sat in the pitch-black sealed room. Minutes ticked by. 10 minutes, 20, 30. 40 minutes of silence and darkness. You can almost picture the SPR team exchanging knowing glances in the dark, thinking, well, isn't this convenient? The moment trained observers are present, the so-called spirit activity grinds to a halt. They were likely preparing their skeptical conclusions, ready to note that the phenomena conveniently failed to manifest under scientifically controlled conditions. It seemed the Scole mystery was about to be declared a non-event. But just as they were probably solidifying their dismissal, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Suddenly, the room became intensely cold, that same unnatural chill the Scole group had reported earlier. And then the lights appeared. The familiar, small, purposeful lights began to dance in the darkness. But this time, something was different. Something utterly baffling occurred. The lights didn't just interact with the Scole 4, they began responding directly to the silent, unspoken thoughts of the SPR investigators themselves. Montague Keene, the career skeptic, decided to test this internally, thinking silently in German, perhaps chosen specifically so no one could lip-read or accidentally overhear. He thought the command, "Make a triangle." To his astonishment, the lights zipped into a distinct triangular formation. Professor Ellison then silently thought, "Make a zigzag." The lights immediately shifted, tracing a zigzag pattern in the air. All of this happened without a single word being spoken aloud by anyone. How could disembodied lights possibly perceive and respond instantly to the specific, unspoken, even foreign language thoughts of skeptical visitors? The investigators were stumped. The strangeness continued in subsequent sessions. During one, a crystal materialized on the table just as the Scole group had described happening previously. Professor Ellison, the engineer, picked it up. It felt solid, cool to the touch, undeniably real. Intrigued, he asked the Scole group if he could take the crystal with him for analysis back at his lab. They readily agreed. They had always maintained they wanted scientific scrutiny. Professor Ellison pocketed the crystal and eventually left the farmhouse. But later, when he reached for it, the crystal was gone. It had simply vanished. However, something else was now in his pocket. Something that hadn't been there before, a small circular brass plate smoothly finished, engraved clearly on its surface, were the words, "Arthur Ellison." The shock for Ellison must have been profound, because throughout his interactions with the Scole group, he had never used or mentioned his first name, Arthur. How could an object materialize out of nowhere bearing his private first name? It was another inexplicable event, aimed squarely at a skeptical investigator. Then there were the crucial film tests conducted under the SPR's own strict controls. Remember, the scientists brought their own film, marked it secretly with UV ink, and maintained possession of it throughout the process. They controlled the loading and unloading of the camera in the dark. Despite these precautions designed specifically to prevent any switching or tampering, the impossible happened again. Images appeared on the SPR's own verified film, the same kinds of baffling pictures reported by the Scole Group. Faces of unknown people, detailed landscapes, strange ancient writing, now materialized under the watchful eyes and strict protocols of the scientific investigators. Over the course of some 20 sessions attended by the SPR, these film tests were repeated, with the rules often becoming even more stringent each time, yet the anomalous images continued to appear. The SPR investigators found themselves facing a stark dilemma. On the one hand, their scientific training told them such things were impossible. On the other hand, their own senses under conditions they themselves had controlled were presenting them with evidence that defied explanations. They had a choice. Either they had to consider the possibility that something genuinely unexplained, perhaps paranormal, was occurring, breaking the known rules of science. Or they had to conclude that the 4 members of the Scole Group were pulling off the most sophisticated, flawless, and sustained hoax in the history of psychical research. A hoax so brilliant it could fool trained scientists, engineers, and psychologists repeatedly under rigorous test conditions. And regarding that possibility, the investigators were clear. After extensive observation and investigation, they found absolutely no evidence of fraud. No hidden projectors were ever discovered, no secret helpers found, no tricks identified that could adequately explain how solid objects seemingly appeared from nothing, or how complex images formed inside sealed film packs they themselves controlled. The phenomena then escalated even further, moving into direct verbal communication with the scientists. They began to experience what they termed direct voice. Voices seemed to emanate from the middle of the air in the room, completely separate from any of the people present. These voices spoke directly to the SPR investigators, calling them by name. They discussed intimate details of the investigators' private lives and ongoing professional research, information the Scole Group members couldn't possibly have known. They answered complex, challenging questions posed by the scientists on topics ranging from quantum physics to the nature of human consciousness, often providing specific, verifiable information that was unknown to anyone physically present. Montague Keen, the skeptic, tested this by asking about deceased relatives. The voices responded with startling accuracy, providing specific names, dates, and private family details that Keen later confirmed were entirely correct. Professor Ellison, the engineer, posed intricate questions related to his field. The voices answered with impressive technical detail and accuracy. The investigators recorded these incredible exchanges, capturing the disembodied voices on tape. Audio experts later analyzed these recordings and reportedly confirmed that the voices originated from a point in the middle of the room, away from any of the sitters. Perhaps the most dramatic physical event witnessed by the SPR team involved the heavy seance table. During one session, it began to float. Professor Ellison, wanting to test the force involved, decided to physically intervene. He put his entire weight, and he was not a small man, onto the levitating table, trying to push it back down to the floor. Incredibly, the table resisted his force, remaining suspended several inches above the ground, seemingly held by an immense invisible power. Cameras were rolling, capturing this unbelievable sight. And during this event, a clear voice announced from the empty air a message captured on the audio recording: "We exist in dimensions perpendicular to yours." After 2 years of intensive investigation, attending numerous sessions, and applying rigorous controls, the baffled SPR investigators compiled their findings. They released a comprehensive 300-page report detailing event after event that seemed to break the known laws of science. Phenomena they had witnessed firsthand but could not explain through conventional means or detect any evidence of fraud. 4. The team of many minds had promised proof, and for the skeptical scientists from the SPR, they had delivered something profoundly strange, something that challenged the very foundations of their understanding of reality. Following the intensive investigation by the Society for Psychical Research, the SPR, which concluded with a 300-page report full of witnessed events they couldn't explain and for which they found no evidence of fraud, the focus naturally shifts. While the strange lights, the materialized objects, the impossible photographs, and the disembodied voices were undeniably sensational, the Scole Group and the SPR investigators understood that these phenomena weren't just random occurrences. They were seen as the delivery system, the tangible proof pointing toward something much deeper. The messages. Over the 5 years, the Scole experiments ran from 1993 to 1998. Literally, thousands of messages were reportedly received from the group, calling themselves the Team of Many Minds. Some communications were personal, directed at specific individuals in the room, perhaps offering comfort or guidance. But the vast majority, the core of the communication, seemed intended for a much broader audience. They were messages the team claimed for all of us, for humanity itself, delivered at what they suggested was a critical juncture in our history. When pieced together, these thousands of messages formed a remarkably consistent and coherent narrative, a distinct worldview. At its very foundation was a radical redefinition of consciousness and reality. The team communicated that consciousness isn't merely the result of neurons firing in our brains. It's not just awareness as we typically understand it. Instead, they proposed that consciousness is the fundamental fabric of reality itself. Everything, in essence, is consciousness. And if consciousness is the ultimate reality, then the concept of death as a final endpoint simply doesn't hold. We live our physical lives. We experience physical death, but our core consciousness, the essence of who we are, continues. It evolves. It learns. It takes the experiences gained during a lifetime and then perhaps returns to or rejoins some vast universal source of consciousness. This might sound familiar, echoing concepts found in many spiritual traditions throughout history. Interestingly, the source material notes a parallel here with studies conducted much later by the United States military through the Gateway process at the Monroe Institute, which also explored models of consciousness surviving bodily death and interacting with a universal field. It seemed the team was presenting a very old idea, but perhaps with a new emphasis or context. Flowing from this idea of fundamental consciousness was the message about human potential. Our current awareness, they suggested, is just scratching the surface. We typically perceive the world through the lens of 3 spatial dimensions, but the team spoke of reality encompassing at least 7 dimensions. They claimed that humans possess incredible latent abilities, potentials locked within our consciousness that we rarely access, abilities like telepathy, direct mind-to-mind communication, and remote viewing, the capacity to perceive distant places or events mentally, and even direct access to knowledge and information without needing to go through the conventional learning process. These weren't presented as supernatural powers, but as natural potentials of consciousness waiting to be awakened. This awakening, the team claimed, was linked to a major event they saw coming for the Earth, an event they consistently referred to as the crossing point. They described this as a significant shift in the planet's fundamental frequency, a raising of its energy level. This wasn't just some abstract metaphysical concept. They predicted it would have tangible effects on human minds globally. As the Earth's frequency shifted, human consciousness would naturally begin to resonate with it, triggering the awakening of those dormant abilities: telepathy, heightened intuition, a greater connection to universal knowledge. The Scole experiments themselves, the team implied, were part of the preparation for this shift, perhaps activating these potentials in the Scole 4, and later the investigators helping to seed these ideas and energies into the collective human consciousness to prepare the way. Naturally, if such a monumental shift was coming, the question arose, how should humanity prepare? The team provided guidance. They offered instructions on specific practices designed to help individuals align with this anticipated new frequency. Meditation was stressed not just for relaxation, but as a tool to consciously tune one's own energy field. They provided techniques aimed at helping people perceive beyond the limitations of the 5 physical senses, to see or sense the deeper reality underpinning the material world. A strong emphasis was placed on living in greater harmony, with nature recognizing the interconnectedness of all life, and significantly, they urged an end to conflict. No more fighting was a recurring theme. Much of this advice again resonates with age-old spiritual wisdom found across many cultures, focusing on inner work, peace, and connection. However, the messages weren't solely spiritual or philosophical. One of the most intriguing aspects noted by the investigators was the integration of surprisingly advanced scientific concepts. The communications often touched upon mathematics and quantum physics. At one point, the team even provided detailed plans for constructing devices intended to facilitate clearer communication between their dimension and ours. One specific design described looked like a modified crystal radio. Instead of simple quartz, it utilized germanium, a less common metal known for its semiconductor properties. The idea was that this device could somehow capture spirit voices directly through the crystal's interaction with dimensional energies, feeding the audio straight into a tape recorder without the need for a physical microphone. When investigators looked at these plans, the underlying scientific principles seemed interesting, perhaps even plausible, based on emerging physics concepts. It was a curious blend of the mystical and the technological echoing. As the source transcript notes, the historical attempts by inventors like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, who both worked on devices they hoped could bridge the gap to the other side, with Tesla even convinced his own spirit radio had succeeded. But alongside the messages of hope, potential, and scientific curiosity came darker, more urgent warnings. The team of many minds predicted significant global turmoil ahead. They spoke of widespread political chaos, potential social collapse in various regions, and accelerating climate catastrophe. The root cause, they claimed, was humanity's way of life, being fundamentally out of sync with the Earth's natural energies and rhythms. Our conflicts, our exploitation of resources, our focus on materialism, all contributed to a dissonance that was leading towards disaster. Yet even these dire warnings carried a sliver of hope. The future wasn't predetermined. They insisted these catastrophic outcomes could be avoided if humanity collectively recognized the danger and made a conscious effort to change course to live more harmoniously with each other and the planet. But the window of opportunity was closing. Time, they warned, was running out. As the experiments progressed into their later years around 1996, the team introduced another layer contact with intelligences described as non-human and without physical form. These weren't the spirits of deceased humans, but something different. Entities they referred to as watchers and guardians. These beings were depicted as having an interest in humanity's development, but existing in dimensions far beyond our current comprehension. Direct communication with these watchers and guardians was presented as the next intended phase of the Scole Experiment. Further blurring the lines between the spiritual and the scientific, the team presented the group with a complex mathematical formula. It purported to describe the interaction between different dimensions. When Professor Fontana later showed this formula to contemporary quantum physicists, they were reportedly stunned. They confirmed that the formula accurately represented a theoretical model for quantum entanglement, a complex concept in physics, but crucially, it was a model that hadn't been published yet in any scientific journal. Furthermore, the formula utilized specific scientific symbols and notation that wouldn't appear in mainstream physics literature for another 2 years. This raised profound questions. Were the entities somehow seeing the future of human scientific discovery? Or were they perhaps subtly influencing it, seeding ideas ahead of their time? It echoed the earlier newspaper prediction, suggesting an ability to operate outside the normal flow of linear time. The SPR investigators, meticulously writing down these messages, grew increasingly concerned. The predictions about climate change and political instability seemed disturbingly accurate as they watched world events unfold in the years that followed. Specific details mentioned in the messages, names, dates, places, were reportedly confirmed later by news reports. The unsettling question lingered: was this uncanny foresight, or was something else going on? By late 1997, the tone of the messages became urgent. The team of many minds announced that the formal Scole Experiment was drawing to a close. They stated they had achieved their primary objective. They had successfully built a bridge, however tentative, between dimensions. They had demonstrated phenomena challenging conventional science. And they had planted important ideas and concepts within human consciousness. The next part of the process, they claimed, needed to happen more organically, spreading naturally through human awareness without the focused crucible of the seances. They were pulling back. They said, allowing things to evolve on their own. Their final communications focused heavily on the power and responsibility of individual choice. The future wasn't rigidly fixed. They stressed humanity stood at a crossroads. Awareness could either expand or contract, depending on what individuals and the collective chose to focus on. Fear, they warned, closes the mind and shuts down potential love. Compassion and connection open it, The reality we would experience, they suggested, would be shaped by our collective thoughts and intentions. Their very last message delivered before the formal experiment ceased was simple yet resonant. We are always here. The door remains open. You need only step through. With that, after 5 years of intense activity, the direct communications began to fade, leaving behind a legacy of baffling phenomena and profound, challenging messages. All right, we've journeyed through the remarkable story of the Scole Experiment, the meticulously documented seances, the baffling phenomena witnessed even by skeptical scientists from the Society for Psychical Research, and the profound messages reportedly delivered by the team of many minds. The SPR's own 300-page report acknowledged events they couldn't explain and stated they found no evidence of fraud. It's a compelling narrative suggesting a genuine crack in the veil between worlds. But as with any story that challenges our fundamental understanding of reality, there's another side to the coin, a strong current of skepticism that raises serious questions. We have to ask, was this truly communication with another dimension, proof of life after death? Or was it perhaps one of the most elaborate, patiently executed magic shows in history? To be thorough, we need to step back and look at the evidence or lack thereof through the critical lens of doubt. The first and most glaring issue for any skeptic, the immediate red flag, is the condition under which nearly all these incredible events occurred: total, absolute darkness. While the Scole Group claimed this was necessary for the phenomena for skeptics, darkness is the magician's best friend. It removes the single most important tool we have for objective observation: our eyesight. Yes, the participants wore glowing wristbands, and the argument was that this allowed everyone to see where hands were. But critics point out a crucial distinction. You could see the location of the hands generally linked around the table, but you absolutely could not see what those hands might have been subtly doing. In pitch blackness, slight movements, the manipulation of small objects, triggering hidden devices, all become significantly easier to conceal. Darkness provides the perfect cover for misdirection and sleight of hand, fundamental techniques in stage magic and historically in fraudulent seances, without the ability to visually verify what was happening. Second by second, relying solely on sound touch and brief flashes of light makes objective assessment incredibly difficult. Then there's the evidence that sounds so compelling on the surface, the images appearing on sealed film, especially the film brought and controlled by the SPR investigators themselves. How could that possibly be faked? Skeptics point to potential loopholes. While the SPR brought their own film and marked it, the critical factor is that the Scole Group members were always present and essentially controlled the environment, the darkroom. Critics argue that even with the SPR present the 5 years of practice among the Scole 4 combined with the inherent confusion and potential distractions of a dark seance room, perhaps coinciding with other phenomena like lights or sounds, could have provided opportunities. The possibility remains skeptics insist that the original Scole members familiar with the routine and the darkness could have deftly switched the SPR's marked film packs or individual sheets with pre-prepared fakes containing the desired images during the session. The most damning point here, according to critics, is the lack of definitive independent verification after the fact. Apparently, no outside independent laboratory ever examined the developed SPR film, to rigorously confirm the presence and integrity of the investigator's secret UV markings, or to scientifically rule out the possibility of a switch having occurred. That crucial final step of verification seems to have been missing, leaving a significant shadow of doubt over what many consider the strongest piece of physical evidence. Another major red flag waved by skeptics is the group's consistent refusal for most of the experiment's duration to allow video recording. In today's world, and even back in the 90s, video, especially infrared video, capable of seeing in low or no light, would have been the ideal objective way to document the phenomena. Imagine having clear footage of the table levitating or the lights forming patterns. The Scole Group's explanation was that electronic camera equipment interfered with the delicate spirit energy needed for the phenomena to manifest. From a skeptic's viewpoint, this explanation sounds incredibly convenient. It effectively barred the best possible means of either proving the phenomena beyond doubt or exposing any trickery involved. Tellingly, the source material notes that on the occasions when infrared cameras were eventually permitted, either late in the Scole experiments or in subsequent related investigations, the reported frequency and intensity of the strange events decreased dramatically, sometimes stopping altogether. This correlation is highly suggestive to critics. When objective see-in-the-dark recording was possible, the phenomena seemed to vanish. Adding fuel to the skeptical fire was a discovery made later. Two of the core Scole Group members, Alan and Diana Bennett, had a background performing stage magic before they became involved in psychical research. They apparently didn't volunteer this information during the main Scole investigation period. When asked about it later, they acknowledged their past involvement in magic, but firmly maintained that their work within the Scole experiment was entirely genuine and separate from their previous performance experience. However, for skeptics, this revelation is deeply significant. Stage magicians are masters of illusion, deception, and misdirection. They possess a specific skill set, perfect for creating convincing paranormal-like effects under controlled conditions, especially in darkness. Knowing that half of the core group possess this background inevitably raises questions about whether those skills might have been employed consciously or unconsciously during the Scole sessions. Furthermore, when professional magicians and experts in seance trickery reviewed the detailed accounts of the Scole phenomena, many concluded that the reported events bear a striking resemblance to classic illusions and techniques used by fraudulent mediums for well over a century. They argue that most, if not all, of the Scole effects could potentially be replicated using relatively simple established methods requiring skill and practice rather than supernatural intervention. Consider their explanations. The spirit lights, easily achievable with small concealable LEDs, perhaps attached to fingers or manipulated with thin wires or hidden magnets. Their movement could be controlled quite precisely, even with glowing wristbands visible. Objects appearing out of thin air, Apports. This is classic sleight of hand and misdirection. Objects could be hidden in pockets, specially constructed clothing, or even compartments within the table or room, then produced subtly during moments of darkness or distraction. The photos on sealed film. As mentioned, switching pre-exposed film sheets or packs for the genuine ones is a known technique among illusionists familiar with photographic methods. It requires nerve timing and opportunity, all potentially available in the Scole setting. The disembodied voices, small, easily hidden speakers, are readily available. Sound could be pre-recorded or even transmitted wirelessly from an accomplice outside the room. Skilled ventriloquism, while perhaps harder to maintain consistently, is another possibility considered by some critics. The key point made by these magic experts is that no unknown forces or futuristic technology would necessarily be required to stage the Scole phenomena. What would be needed, they argue, is a combination of factors readily available: the absolute darkness, meticulous planning and rehearsal skill in misdirection, and potentially stage magic techniques, and immense patience. A dedicated group of 4 people working in concert over 5 years could theoretically develop and refine an incredibly elaborate and convincing performance designed to fool observers, even skeptical ones, not trained specifically in magic detection techniques. Finally, there's the uncomfortable question of motive. Why would 4 people dedicate 5 years to such an elaborate deception? While the original source narrator is careful not to definitively assign a motive, they do point out a practical reality. Following the Scole experiments and the publicity they generated, the group members did achieve a degree of fame within paranormal circles. They gave lectures for which fees were presumably charged. They wrote books detailing their experiences. And as the original narrator dryly commented, "Remember, there's always a book." They subsequently offered seminars and potentially private séance sittings, also likely involving payment. Again, this doesn't prove the entire 5-year experiment was a deliberate fraud conceived for financial gain. The initial motivation might have been genuine curiosity, but the fact remains that significant money was made as a result of the Scole story. For skeptics, this provides a plausible, understandable human motive: fame and financial reward, that cannot be entirely dismissed when evaluating the authenticity of the claims. Taken together, these skeptical arguments, the reliance on darkness, the questions surrounding the film evidence, the refusal of video, the stage magic background, the resemblance to known tricks, and the potential financial motive, paint a compelling counter-narrative suggesting that the Scole experiment, despite its intriguing details, might have been a masterpiece of illusion rather than a genuine window into another dimension. So, where does that leave us with the Scole experiment? We have these 2 compelling narratives running side by side. On one hand, we have detailed accounts of seemingly impossible events, witnessed not just by the core group, but by experienced, skeptical investigators who couldn't find evidence of trickery and were left deeply puzzled. We have the sheer volume of phenomena, the lights, the objects, the photos, the voices, the messages, all meticulously documented over 5 years. On the other hand, we have significant red flags raised by critics: the ever-present darkness, the questions surrounding the film evidence, the convenient refusal of video recording, the stage magic background, and plausible explanations for how much of it could have been faked, using known techniques perhaps driven by motives we can all understand. Even the SPR investigators, despite their inability to find fraud, stopped short of declaring definitive proof of spirits or an afterlife. They were left, much like many of us perhaps, without a neat, tidy answer. Maybe the enduring legacy of Scole isn't about finding that absolute proof one way or the other. Perhaps it lies more in the undeniable impact it had on those who participated. We heard accounts mentioned, even in the skeptical reviews, of people leaving sessions profoundly moved, feeling comforted, connected to lost loved ones, or experiencing a deep sense of peace and wonder. Whether it was genuine otherworldly contact or an incredibly sophisticated illusion, the experience was undeniably real and meaningful for many. And perhaps that's a good place to leave it. In the face of life's biggest mysteries, consciousness, what happens after we pass the nature of reality itself? Maybe the answers we find or the beliefs that bring us comfort and hope are valuable in their own right. What do you think happened in that dark cellar in Scole? Was it a bridge between worlds or a masterful performance? I'd love to read your thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me today as we explored this fascinating and puzzling story. If you enjoyed diving into mysteries like this one, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing. If you haven't already, we'll be exploring many more intriguing corners of the known and unknown world together. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and thank you for watching.